welcome. Now, when I was slightly younger, my Friday nights used to be about going to a club all night, drinking, heavily whooping it up. But frankly, as we know, economics is the new rock and roll. So welcome to my astonishingly erudite and clever panel. Welcome to you as well to discuss at this wonderful Intelligence Squared event, can we have prosperity without growth? Now, we're going to have most of the discussion here on stage, but given it is Friday night and we're here to have fun, we're also going to come to you, our wonderful audience. So if we could have the house lights up slightly, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions just to set the feel for this event. Now, put up your hands nice and brightly if this year you feel economically, and of course there are lots of other ways to feel, but economically better off now than you did 1 year ago. Hands up if you feel you do feel better off now than a year ago. Okay, that's more than I expected actually, so that's interesting. There's a sort of number in there, people who feel optimistic. Put your hands up if you feel better off now than you did 10 years ago economically. Many, many more. Okay, excellent. We've got a not unoptimistic crowd in today, which is very, very good to see. Our fantastic speakers. Bim Afolami, Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. Harpenden is where my uncle and aunt live. Southbank Road.
Are they good Conservatives?
I'm not going to reveal that. It's none of your business, Bim. I'm sure you knock on their door regularly. But it's good that we have a personal connection on the stage immediately. Since 2017, former Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party. In Parliament, you are Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Renewable and Sustainable Energy and Chairman of the Regulatory Reform Group. Bim, welcome to this event. To your left, that may mean politically or not, I don't know. Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge University and author of, among other fantastic books, Disorder, Hard Times in the 21st Century, shortlisted for the 2022 Financial Times Business Book of the Year. You have written very broadly on geopolitics, books, but also for the Financial Times, the New York Times, and the New Statesman. And you're the co-host of a new podcast, These Times for Unheard. So let's all subscribe to that. It'd be very good. And a reason, Helen, at least for you being here this evening, more subscriptions to your podcast.
Thank you.
Now, Kate Raworth is the only person on this stage who has props. And one of those props is a tube, and the other prop is 2 lengths of rope. So let's see where that takes us later on this evening. A couple of us have had a glass of wine in the backstage, so who knows what joys could befall us later. But Kate, you are one of the brains behind new ways of thinking about economics, alternatives to what we describe as growth. The creator of the donut model of social and planetary boundaries and author of the internationally best-selling book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. So what an exciting evening we're going to have. We're going to have a few minutes from each of the guests. We'll then have a bit of a discussion here. But please do ask questions, and welcome to everyone who excitingly is watching this online as well. So not only is there a packed, sold-out auditorium here at the Purcell Room in central London, but millions are watching this globally around the world. Not since Beyonce's Stockholm first concert of 3 days ago have so many people been engaged in an internet streaming event. A couple of thoughts from me before we open up to Bim, who's going to speak first. A brief story about my family and a broader thought. Since 1945, there have only been 3 general elections when people's real incomes were falling. 1945, 2010, and 2017. And they didn't work out well for any of the incumbent leaders. Churchill, Gordon Brown, Theresa May. I think one of the big issues for us to discuss tonight is the notion, as Adair Turner, the former head of the Financial Services Authority, said to me in an interview I did when I was the economics editor of the BBC, capitalism has fundamentally failed if, at the end of the year, people who are resident in capitalist economies do not feel slightly better off in December than they did in January, as long as they worked reasonably hard and played by the rules. That has not been true for the majority of the years we have experienced since 2008. And Adair Turner, Lord Turner, said capitalism had therefore failed in its promise. Second point is a little thing about my family. My mother's, it's her 80th birthday this year. Happy birthday, Mum, if you're watching. She won't be, but... Oh, nice. I have to get her to watch back that little bit, because she'll be very nice to see that. Thank you very much. She's 80 this year. Her generation grew up post-war with a relatively settled notion of the Keynesian compact, that the government, business, and labour would work together in some way for the good of society, and that growth was baked in. That was her generation. My generation, it is not my birthday today, but you can clap for me if you want to. We grew up with the notion that the market would provide. Chicago School, I grew up through the Thatcher and Reagan era. As long as I worked hard and played by the rules, the market would provide, because we'd had the breakdown of that former compact, and growth was baked in. My daughter is 23, my son is 19. They certainly won't be watching. But for them, what is the new model? And I think since 2008, there is no guarantee of growth, and there is no guarantee of who will provide for them, and there is no real structure and narrative about what the economy, politics, society should look like. And that's why we have such clever people here tonight to discuss the issues across those generations. So, Bim, if I could come to you first to give us some overview around this notion of what really is prosperity and why have we been struggling to such an extent, I think, since the financial crisis, to really rediscover what that is for the good of the people.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you all for being here. The way I think about this is, I suppose, to answer the exam question at the top, is can we have prosperity without growth? I don't think we can. I think we do need economic growth, but it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for prosperity. And what I mean by prosperity is improved living standards for everybody. Living standards are not just income, it's the state of your health, it's the opportunities you have through education, the ability to enjoy leisure, the ability to raise a family, and to enjoy life as well. All of those things together, of which economics is a key part, but not the only part, is how I think of prosperity. That's what I try to do, representing my constituents in Parliament, and indeed broadly as a Member of Parliament for the country. And I think that you need economic growth in order to achieve that. But you mentioned the financial crisis, and I think that sometimes we almost fail to come to terms with just how seismic a hit to living standards that was. And to make this point, it was a greater hit than World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. And if our economy had grown at the same rate after 2008, the 15 years or so after that period of time, to about now, as it had the 15 years before the financial crisis, our economy per head would be 22% higher. 22%. Now, that's not to say there were not weaknesses in the pre-financial crisis economy. We had regional imbalances, there were problems around infrastructure and skills and various things. And those weaknesses were there, and we needed to, and to some degree, the strong growth actually hid a lot of those weaknesses. But just to make this point, imagine if our GDP per capita were 22% higher now, a lot of the political problems that we have, that we discuss, whether it be around healthcare, climate, energy, education, whatever it is, are often downstream of the core fact that we don't have enough economic growth. Now, conservatives will typically, when we think about economic growth, we think about the private sector. Obviously, the private sector is the engine of economic growth. And when conservatives have too often talked about this recently, we've sort of gone for tax cuts, supply side measures. Let's think about more tax cuts. On the left, they have often said, well, what we need is more public spending, and through public spending we get more growth. And obviously, at different times in different areas, you obviously need a combination of supply side measures and public spending and how the government works. But it's my view that the missing link, what makes how we need to turn higher growth into prosperity, is more effective state capacity. And I say that as a strong conservative. More effective state capacity, not only to turn the higher growth into prosperity, but indeed to help generate the higher growth. Why? Because the challenges that we face now in the mid-2020s, or coming into the mid-2020s, into the 2030s, climate, I mentioned energy and how we transition to a clean energy future, the aging society, which means that the demand on healthcare keeps rising every single year, and the constant need to improve educational standards. These challenges can only be met by more effective state capacity, mobilizing and working with private sector, society, and public sector more broadly to achieve those better outcomes. And I'll stop there, but we should talk this evening not just about the private sector, but also about how a more effective, agile state in the center, working with more delivery and more spending and more responsibility at local government, both bits doing things, frankly, much more effectively, sorting out our regulatory system, getting higher quality at every level in Westminster and in Whitehall. I'm not leaving out politicians. Westminster and in Whitehall. Together, if we do that, we can generate more economic growth and turn that growth into prosperity for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Bim. Just one additional question before I come to you, Helen, on that. This notion of the more active state, or agile, I think, as you say. You have economists like Mariana Mazzucato talking about the entrepreneurial state, this idea. How widely shared is that within the Conservative Party? So, 2 years ago, with William Lewis, who's the former chief executive and publisher of the Wall Street Journal, we launched our own business to try and create trusted journalism for the next generation of consumers. As an entrepreneur, I'm interested in what you think, Bim, the state should be doing to help us grow a fledgling media company here in the UK and in the US, which is what we're doing, but UK focused. How is the state supposed to help us do that, creating jobs and hopefully a new successful business?
I'll think of, there are lots of things, but let me pick out three. The first is to have a regulatory system that isn't there to deliberately stop things happening, but to help things happen. And too much of our regulatory system is messy, things take too long, and it's not about more regulations or fewer regulations, it's just ones that are effective and decisions are made on time. And whether you're doing something in the back of your, extending your house right the way through to getting some approval in your media business, I think that sorting out the regulatory system is one thing the state can do. It doesn't cost any money. Second thing is your members of staff, they need to be able to get in and out of work easily. Things like the transport system, making sure those are more effectively delivered. I'm not talking about the intention. I'm not arguing about where you should do one project to another project. Simply the delivery, the speed with which we do things, so slow. So again, the government being more effective can help you with that. And ultimately, I suppose the third thing is that the overarching tax environment needs to be competitive compared to other places. That does not mean that you just need to have the lowest tax rate possible, because of course you need to pay for various things that we're talking about. But unless you can be competitive in that regard, then people who have the option don't come here, and they don't create the jobs, and they don't create the opportunities. So I think it's a combination, as I've said, between more effective state, can be more active. It doesn't have to be bigger, but it has to be more effective, and the private sector having the freedom to do as much as it can in a simple way.
Thank you, Bim. Helen, let's go to that exam question. Can we have prosperity without growth?
I'm actually going to dodge that question for the moment anyway, because I think actually we are where we are, fits with some of what Bim said anyway, is because we don't know how to do politics without growth. We don't know how to do democratic politics without growth in Western countries. And this has got a relatively short history. It goes back actually to your starting place, Kamal. It goes back to 1945 and the post-war settlement, which was rested fundamentally on the idea that there would be and could be economic growth, and that the state could do various things, not least managing demand, in order to keep growth going. And that was a necessary condition of having full male employment. It was a necessary condition of having a state that was going to spend as much money as it was going to on the welfare state, on the National Health Service. In order to keep being able to meet people's expectations, then tax revenues needed to keep growing, and for tax revenues to keep growing, then we needed economic growth. I think what then happened is from sort of the late 60s into the early 70s, it became very apparent that growth on a finite planet had some limitations, shall we say. And that was compounded by the fact that if we move outside Western countries, there was even more reason really to become obsessed with growth, because growth was about how we stopped being a poor agrarian country and became a more prosperous industrial country. But what we saw certainly by the beginning of the 70s was a growing understanding that you couldn't have infinite growth on a finite planet, that there are resource limits ultimately to growth that we don't know really when they decisively kick in. And that's what produced the limits to growth agenda, which was about resource constraints, it was about population, it was about pollution. And I think that what we've lived through in the 70s onwards is the way in which we dealt with the limits to growth in the 70s, which was essentially to find a way out of the resource crisis of the 70s by extracting more expensive energy, particularly oil. And at the same time, and I think we in Western countries have to understand this, is that some of the resource constraints that were expected did not materialize because many developing countries had at least 1 decade, perhaps 2 decades of lost development. They just didn't grow anywhere near as rapidly in the latter part of the 70s, 80s, into the early 90s. But what has, I think, happened since the early 2000s, and I think that 2008 is really, in some sense, the crash. It's just a kind of symptom rather than a cause of this, is 2 things. First of all, that one developing country, China, the most populous then country in the world, became astonishingly successful at development, and its development then put a lot more pressure, not only on the resource question, energy, but also on climate. Because somewhere around 2006, I think it was, China overtook the United States to become the largest carbon emitter in the world. And China's resource demand happened to rise as quickly as it did at the same point in which the supply of oil, the production of oil at least, was stagnating. And so I think we've been living in a world since about 2005 where growth is really quite difficult for most Western economies, exception being the United States, because the United States really saved the world in the 2010s, or saved the world economy in the 2010s from its resource problems by the shale boom. And that also drove growth in the United States. Our problem now is we have all the problems of resource constraints because all the damage that has been done to the biosphere by the pursuit of growth, but we haven't lost, for good reasons, the political need for economic growth, because it's very difficult for democratic politicians to do democratic politics without it. And that is, in part, I think, because of the expectations that most people have that their living standards are going to go up, even when they in practice don't. But it's also because the National Health Service needs growth. And unless we find a different way of what the state does, we are going to need economic growth, even though we have to face just how difficult it is.
Helen, do you think we need to move away from what we judge growth to be? The underlying issue seems to be often that the way we measure growth, rather than measuring maybe wealth in a broader sense, is part of the difficulty. GDP is a notion invented in the 1930s. It deals, frankly, with industrial production. Do we need to move on in terms of how we judge things? Is that a journey we can possibly go on?
I definitely think there's all kinds of problems with the abstract idea of growth when it's measured by gross domestic product increase. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the obsession with growth comes in a reaction to the economic disasters of the 1930s and the Depression, and understanding what the political consequences of such high unemployment are and how destabilizing that they are for democracy. So I think it's entirely understandable when we think about it politically why we became obsessed with gross domestic product and measuring how we're doing economically that way, because that's what happens when you've lived through a decade in which it collapses. On the other hand, I think there's something quite misleading, not only in terms of the way in which it sort of fetishizes material questions above all else, but also because it makes our understanding of how economies work very money dependent. And it stops us, I think, thinking about energy questions. And I think that that has not helped us, because I don't think it helps our understanding of what has gone on in the 21st century, both in terms of why the climate emergency has materialized, but also in terms of why economic growth has been so difficult when we don't put energy first and foremost in our economic understanding. And I think that one of the things that the obsession with GDP does and growth does is just keep us in this money understanding of the economy. And I'm not saying there's no point to that, I'm just saying it's nowhere near sufficient to understanding where we are.
Yeah. Now, Kate, you've worked super hard at building new narratives around what we should imagine the good society to look like, moving away from the notion of what growth is. Just explain to us the principles, the ideas behind this notion of donut economics and living within the boundaries that are set by this planet we live on.
Okay, so I'm going to, fascinating contributions from everyone. So I'm going to pull out, right? Here we are. We're almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century. And we're in the UK. So we're sitting here in one of the richest countries in the world. And that means we're sitting in one of the richest countries in the history of humanity. Today, now, this nation has more wealth and resources at its disposal than almost any country has had in the whole of history. Isn't it extraordinary that we can only imagine that we can solve our problems by having yet more? How would we say that to people in Bangladesh who have 1/30 of the income, or people in Nigeria who have 1/10 of the income that we have, or Tanzania? How would we explain to them that we, in our great wealth, can only imagine that we can solve the problems that we have in our nation if we have yet more? And I think part of it is because we are so deeply entrenched in a mindset that thinks growth is good. Hosepipe.
Excellent. The first prop.
Always find a bit of hosepipe down the back of the sofa. So I like to ask, so can we have prosperity without growth? Prosperity, what does that word mean? Prospero, as Tim Jackson said, prospero, that which we hope for. What do we hope for? And the 20th century taught us to hope for more and told us that the shape of progress is this. It's ever-rising growth, more and more, and it's exponential, so 2% on 2% on 2%. It goes not just up to here, it goes through the ceiling. That's what exponential things do. They go through the ceiling. An economy that grows at 2.5% per year sounds very modest. What's not to like? It doubles in 30 years. And when economic activity, which what we're calling growth or GDP, It's not angels dancing on a pinhead. It's materially intensive, it's energy intensive. And we can try and de-intensify it, but we cannot disconnect that intensity. So every time we grow, we're using more stuff, especially more materials. Now, this has been the shape of progress we've inherited, the 20th century dominant shape. And it's deep in us, because growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. It makes sense that we love growth. It means something's alive. We love to see our children grow. We love to see our gardens grow. It's spring. We are seeing the plants grow. But if we look to nature, nothing in nature does this. Nothing in nature succeeds by trying to grow forever. Anything that tries to grow forever will destroy itself or the system on which it depends. And we know that in our own bodies, and we call it cancer. And we move in to stop it. Something that tries to grow forever inside a delicately balanced living whole, like this delicately balanced living planet, will destroy the systems on which it depends. So in nature, flick of the wrist changes everything. Things grow, and then they grow up, and they mature. And that is what means that they can thrive and they can last. And isn't it funny that when our kids leave school and get a job or go to university, we don't say, oh, they're growing. We say they're thriving. We understand it in human life. We come to thrive. To me, the existential economic question of the 21st century is, can we grow up and learn to stop chasing growth and learn to recognize we have so much? How do we learn to thrive? Let me finish by saying, you began by saying your parents' generation believed that it was the public sector that would deliver. And your generation, our generation, believed and were taught that it was the market that would deliver, and both have growth baked in. I really think there's this rising generation of young people, and they march in the streets, and they are some of the world's most profound climate leaders. They know that ultimately it's Earth who delivers. And she delivers for us every day. She delivers us a stable climate. She delivers rain from which plants grow, from which food comes. She delivers clean air and healthy oceans and forests that grow and give us timber and resources. We are part of a delicately balanced living planet. So for me, the concern isn't that we're going to run out of stuff. We're going to run out of copper. We're going to run out of oil. No, the fear is that by mining and burning that fossil fuel, we destabilize the balanced systems on which life depends. And that's where I think the Limits to Growth report of the 1970s focused on running out of stuff. They actually didn't yet know enough about the science of the delicate balance of a stable climate and fertile soils and healthy oceans and a protective ozone layer overhead. We know that. And we need to learn to belong within that. And that is what will enable us to thrive. So donut economics says the goal is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And it's about finding balance. It's not endless growth, it's balance. And if I do that with my hands, it's like a heartbeat. We know that balance in our own bodies. Health lies in balance. Enough, but not too much, of water, of food, of heat, of oxygen. Can we take what we deeply understand in our bodies and bring it to the world, to our economies? And I agree with both of you. It's how can we now create a politics that actually can deal with the reality of humanity as part of a living world and stop just selling the public? It alarms me that both you have Liz Truss and Keir Starmer going growth, growth, growth. It's the most reductive political conversation I've heard in decades, and it's happening in this country. That is alarming. We need to broaden our vision, not diminish it to this one metric that doesn't serve us in the 21st century.
Now, Kate, have you considered becoming a politician? Why not?
Because I think you need people who can speak freely and speak to a vision that's possible and not be constrained and caught, as so many of today's politicians are, in growthist speak. And if you dare to speak about, only two politicians in the UK who I've heard dare to question growth: Caroline Lucas, the one Green MP, Clive Lewis, Labour MP. They're the only ones I've heard dare to question it. Because if you dare question it, if I dare to say, can we have prosperity without growth, the whole onus is on you to prove how. And everybody who's in the growth paradigm just sits back as if it's working, and it's not working. It's destroying the life on Earth. So, no, I don't want to be a politician because I believe we need people who can speak that language and work with businesses and communities and teachers and cities and start to bring through this new possibility and help create space for those politicians, because we need many voices across the political spectrum speaking to this living reality.
Kate, thank you so much. What great first comments from our panel. Just want to welcome again the people who are on the live stream to the Southbank Centre in London. Can we have prosperity without growth? Please do send in your questions, and audience, we will be coming to you in a little while to get some questions from the audience as well. So do be thinking and noodling away about your fantastic questions for the panel. Bim, can I bring you in on politicians will never be brave enough to make the leap?
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that I agree with that subject, but that's what's been raised by both Helen and Kate, that we can't actually have a serious conversation about the limits of, let's call it, economic growth, because politicians in the mainstream parties will never go there. Are you constrained by what you can say because you've got to keep to the simple narrative, growth is good? Economic growth is good, because growth of all sorts is good, but economic growth.
Well, look, I don't think I feel unduly constrained, but I listened very carefully and I've read a lot of what Kate has written, and I want to just address some of the points and see and give you my take on them in that context. I think that, and what I was at pains to do, not just here, but whenever I'm speaking, whenever I speak to constituents or in the House of Commons or whatever it is, to think about what are the outcomes for people, right? So you mentioned, we're stuck in a growth paradigm that means that, we keep repeating this sort of mantra, growth is good. But ultimately, what all politicians are in the business of is delivering better outcomes for people, not just materially, but also in education, health, all sorts of opportunities that are not just material. The problem is that we live in a world whereby unless you have enough material, free money, whether as an individual, a family, or a country, you can't deliver those practical outcomes. So when somebody says, well, this growth, it's sort of running out and there's nothing you can do, we now need to just think about how to make do with what we have or to not grow anymore, that's very difficult if waiting lists are rising, right? That's very difficult if there are no spaces to get on the course you want, to further education or university. So I am all ears as to how we now, and you're right about living in a more mature society. I mean, obviously we're not in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or we're not China in 1983, or of course there are periods of time when just things are going exponentially like that. You look at the whole Western economy, the difficulties that we have are mirrored by the difficulties in most European countries, most Western countries, as Helen outlined in the energy space as well. But you do need to deliver better outcomes for people all the time. And some of those things are non-material. I mentioned regulation. I mean, boring though it is, we can get a much better regulatory system without spending more money. It's just thinking about it more smartly. But some of them do require more money. Why? Because people, as human beings, we always want to get things to be better. I want my children's lives to be better than my own. And I don't mean better in them having more money than me. I mean actually have better experiences, to live longer, to have better opportunities. And so that's what we're focused on. I don't think when SA's stuck in this sort of paradigm that you've described, I think what we are stuck in is a paradigm of trying to make things better for everybody. And so I'm all ears as to how we can do that both financially, economically, and in other ways.
So Kate, that's really interesting. We've had a question from Sarah, who goes to the same area, Helen, that you have, and Bim, that you have. And maybe, Kate, you could help us on this journey. This notion of things like the NHS aren't like a maturing tree. They don't get to a stage where we say, right, the NHS is now the oak tree, and that's kind of, as long as we keep it the same shape, doing the same thing. But actually, the demands on the NHS are growing and becoming more expensive. So Sarah asks, how can you fund the NHS and public services without economic growth of the type that you so persuasively have said is the wrong, or the wrong metric to have?
Health is one of the most fundamental things that we want, and that's why in this in this country, there's a particular love of the NHS. We can have all the healthcare that we want if we choose to invest in it with strong state capacity, right? So if we choose as a nation to invest the extraordinary resources, richer than almost any nation before us, if we choose to invest a significant portion of our collective wealth in healthcare, we can have that. We do not need an endlessly growing economy to deliver that. Costa Rica has higher life expectancy than the United States and has 1/3 of the income per person of the United States because they've chosen to invest in public healthcare, and we all know what's happening with healthcare in the US. It doesn't work. So it's a choice. To say that the only way we can have healthcare in this country is an endlessly growing economy is to miss the fact that it's about public choices of what we collectively provide: public healthcare, public education, public transit, what George Monbiot, the writer, calls public luxury and private sufficiency, rather than, and I want to come to this point, a country of private luxury and public squalor. Because what we haven't yet mentioned in this debate is this country is extraordinarily unequal. So when we talk about growth, we always should say, whose growth? When the UK GDP is growth, whose growth?
Have you ever thought of being a politician?
Can I just put it,
Sorry, I just want to
put it down?
again.
So, in the UK, the richest 1% have seen their incomes rising since 1980. The richest 5 households in this country own more wealth than the poorest 20% of people. The average worker's wage has actually fallen by around 11%, £11,000 in real terms over the last 15 years. The number of people queuing at food banks and asking for has doubled over the last 5 years, while the wealthiest are running away. So this is why I think we actually really, really want growth, in the words of Henry Wallach, a former US governor of the Federal Reserve. As long as there is growth, there is hope. And when growth stops, the dream that everybody will have more stops, because suddenly the party stops and we look and we see how it's distributed and it's stark. Why have we allowed this nation to become so unequal? Why do we invest so little in public health and public education and allow these vast inequalities of the richness that we have here? Friends in Tanzania, I think they must just look at us and think, you have people sleeping in the streets, you have people queuing for food, you have 30 times the wealth that we have. Why have you allowed this to happen? So it's not about the chasing endless growth, it's about far more equitably using the resources we have, including investing in the NHS, including investing in schools, so that what we want, and I agree with you, Bim, I want a better life for my kids. I want them to have a great education in a state school. I want to know that when I'm ill, I can go to the A&E department, I can go to the NHS and I will be cared for. I want to be able to travel here and home on good public transport. I want public luxury. And that's a political choice that we make, not through chasing growth, but through deciding as a nation to invest in it.
So who gets less, Kate?
That 1% that is running away with and chasing money off into tax havens, the Shell and BP, who just made 40 billion, 30 billion pounds in the last year from fossil fuels, which should be banned now in this nation because we know too much about climate change to permit that to go on. Because if we want better lives for our kids, we stop that right now.
Stop fossil fuels right now.
Apparently.
Helen, give us your perspective on disorder. Very, very cleverly brings together, as you said, that sort of mix of economics, but particularly energy, oil, finance, and politics, and how they're all interconnected. Kate has enormously passionately and persuasively given us one model of how we can rethink what the notion of growth really should mean. I just wondered, Helen, what is your map for the future that is built on your understanding of the disorder that has been created in the past?
Well, I think we have to start with what an unbelievably difficult position that we are in with energy. And that is because we are simultaneously in a crisis of the fossil fuel energy regime. And I am afraid don't believe that we can get rid of fossil fuels anytime soon. And we are trying to reinvent the entire material basis of our civilization, growth or no growth, with a different kind of energy regime, a low carbon energy regime. And progress towards that is very slow when you look at it in relation to the aspirations that have been there really since the 1970s to have an energy revolution of one kind or another. And some of those reasons are because there's insufficient political will to pursue the energy transition. Some of it is because more investment could take place and it doesn't take place in capacity. But it's also because it's incredibly difficult to pursue the energy transition. We are trying, leaving nuclear power out of it, to move from a world of higher density energy to lower density energy. Every energy transition that's taken place before has gone in the opposite direction, from lower to higher. And we're trying to reverse that and have essentially the same standards of living, let alone the idea whether they're going to increase or not. I think that that's probably not possible. And I think that, though, I have a great deal of sympathy for Bim and his piece, because trying to explain this and trying to engage with this as a political problem is absolutely a mind-boggling thing to do. But I don't think that we're going to get very far in the next 10 years, 20 years, without having some kind of reckoning with the problem that energy poses us. And what we have to understand is this is where we as human beings, we can't innovate our way out of the fundamental energy aspects of this. We can innovate our way to technologies that will allow us to do various things with energy more effectively or less effectively, but we can't create energy. We just can't. That's the laws of physics, that we can't. We as humanity have to live with energy constraints. And I think that we've reached a point in our politics, in some sense, humanity's reached a point where we have to face that much more directly than we've hitherto done. And that's partly what is making politics so difficult, and partly why it then becomes so difficult to articulate any kind of coherent vision. I could give you some aspirations, but I mean, they just seem like...
Where do you start that, Helen? Where do you start that conversation? Because, Kate, I'm going to come back to you before I come to you, Ben, but Helen, for you first. Where do you start that conversation? Because, Kate, and I might have misheard you, but it sounds like you would rather, to get to some of the solutions you passionately believe in, you want to order people to do certain things from tomorrow which rely on fossil fuel. Now, Helen, politically, to me, that is an impossibility. Socially, it's an impossibility, because people believe that lots of the way they live presently is their right to live like that. Now, you may disagree with that, but I can't see how you can start having a conversation with the population of the UK or the population of any Western developed nation to say some authority is going to order you to stop doing things in the way you're doing them at present. But I wanted to ask Helen first, because you raised first this idea that politicians, it's impossible. So where could that debate start, apart from in very clever books and wonderful debates like this?
No, I mean, I certainly don't think the answers come from books. Don't get me wrong at all. I mean, all I would say is this, is that I think that in this respect we are in a better place now than we were 2 or 3 years ago. Because I think that the levels of consciousness about energy and the complexity of energy is a lot higher than it was. I actually think Russia's war against Ukraine is responsible in part for the fact that people have become more energy aware. It's a lot easier to say things about energy than it was 18 months ago. I remember that I wrote a column in the New Statesman when I was still doing that. I think it was in the autumn of 2021, and I framed it around what was going on in gas markets and the COP summit in Glasgow, and basically said reduced energy consumption would have to be part of politics in the future. And it was kind of like breaking a taboo, it felt like, in saying that. Nobody took any notice of anything that I said about it. It was just kind of a piece that just kind of disappeared into the void. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would say things like this in podcasts, and that people would take me more seriously and start asking questions about it. And I think that is progress, because I think that the age in which these really profound questions, that energy, growth, what does it mean to live on this planet in a sustainable way, couldn't really be talked about seriously. There was lots of gesture politics around it, lots of rhetoric about it. That's what the Net Zero 2050 had in it. But it wasn't serious. Now it's more serious, and that's at least a start.
Yeah. Kate, before I come to you, Ben, Kate, give me some steps to where you want to get to, that you think you could apply to the United Kingdom and people wouldn't be marching in their millions across the bridge in Westminster.
So you said you think I want to order people to do things, as if governments never set any regulations. Governments are ordering people to do things all the time, some of which I deeply disagree with, like it's now practically illegal to have a demonstration if the government think you're going to create disorder. If you're standing there to defend the living world, that's practically illegal. However, sometimes the government, absolutely, governments around the world have been ordering people to cut their carbon emissions as part of the global climate negotiations. Each country has its commitments. When are we going to get to net zero? How are we going to do it? London orders people not to smoke in public places or in restaurants or in pubs. That happened. Now the ultra-low emission zone, the cars are being stopped with bollards from driving in streets. Amsterdam is going to have no fossil fuel vehicles from 2030. When there's a drought, and we're talking, and I deeply agree with Helen that energy is the currency of the world. Money is a human illusion that we've created. Energy is the ultimate currency of life. Let's talk about water. When there's a drought, the government orders us to not wash your cars and to reduce. This is going to become more and more of a reality as energy constraints kick in. The Netherlands have now got what's known as the nitrogen ceiling. They've been told by the European Commission, you are producing far too much effluent because you have too many chickens and cows and pigs, and you're using too much nitrogen. So you need to transform your agriculture. This is getting real because we have overshot the means of the planet. So we need governments that absolutely can talk about the reality of this. It was 40 degrees in England last summer. People are beginning to understand this is real. And we need to reduce our carbon emissions. We need to reduce our water use. And London is at real risk of drought. So I'm not making this stuff up. We need to learn to not think only in terms of better lives in terms of money. And I think actually all of us agreeing that that's not what a better life is. But the resource realities and the fragility of the world means we need to reduce our impact. And by the way, these can be better lives. You know, kids biking to school is a better life than kids being driven to school in gas-guzzling SUVs. I think it's time for governments to edit out certain technologies like SUVs in cities, luxury flights, private jets, those luxury cruise ships. These things do not belong anymore because we know too much. This is an extremely wasteful use of a very precious resource of energy. Yes, let's edit them out and edit in public, accessible, affordable alternatives.
Okay, so Bim, which of those policies are you going to put in the next manifesto? The ending of private jets, the ending of luxury air travel, and the ending of cruise ships. Actually, 1 second. Has anyone been on a cruise ship in this building?
I was talking about the privately owned luxury liners by individuals.
You're denying her next holiday. No.
But you don't mean cruise ships that take you to Brittany ferries. Is that okay?
No, I'm talking about, but I'm talking about luxury ships owned by billionaires.
Right, so those. Are you going to do any of those things?
Look, I'm not sure I agree with that. Let me set it out as I see it. And for a second, to zoom out, and remember, and I think of this, one of the great advantages of having parents who've come from, well, my father's Nigerian, my mother grew up in this country and is also Nigerian, is you do, ever since a young age, I've always seen the world just a bit differently, living in this country and growing up here. And when you are in a third world country, you know, we're a rich country, yes, we're an important country with a wonderful history, but we are a comparatively small part of the world's population. And when you're in other countries, particularly poorer countries, and if in Nigeria somebody, I'm sure there's somebody from Nigeria listening, watching this on live stream, and they may be looking at this debate, and they must be thinking, what planet are these people on? They'll be saying, it's only rich Western people who want to now say, look, world, we've had a good run, and what we've got to do is got to stop all this, and we're just going to manage where we are. But if you want a car, notwithstanding electric vehicles, because as you know, the materials inherent in any electric vehicle need to be mined out of the ground using huge amounts of minerals, and that's a very energy-intensive process, as of course as you fully understand. So if you want a car, you want working electricity, you want even a fraction of the lives that they watch on TV and they see that we have. And then they say that what we should, then they hear us say, no, we've got to stop that. Because the way that is, I'm afraid, is it really drives a lot of people in what we used to call the third world, emerging markets, the developing world, it drives them completely bananas because they say, we have a right to the sort of life that you have here. And we've got to remember that when we have this debate. And just to, in particular, just go back on some of your previous comments. I think that we need to distinguish between a very reasonable debate about how you grow, how material is that, how much do you chase GDP, what are the negative externalities of things that you do? And obviously the environmental debate is a core part of that. And that's a very reasonable debate. But that's not quite the same debate, frankly, a straightforward debate that we've been having for generations about redistribution of wealth. That's a reasonable debate to have. It's what a lot of our politics is about. How much should you tax this person compared to this person or this company? That's reasonable politics. We continue to do that. It's very reasonable to say you think that we should, raise taxes on certain companies or certain rich people or whatever. But bearing in mind, we are at, right now, the highest tax burden than we have had for 70 years. Even if we were to raise that tax burden further, on all the richest people and companies, the ones that were not mobile, the capital that wasn't able to go somewhere else, because obviously quite a lot of it can, I doubt very much that we'd now be in a land of milk and honey where all of the things that we wanted could all automatically be produced. So it requires tough choices. And if you say to people in this audience today, do they feel undertaxed? I suspect a lot of them would probably say no. They probably feel actually, financially, things are quite tough. And a lot of things they want to buy and they want to do that they were doing 10 years ago, they can't do. So I just think that, first of all, we've got to bear in mind we're in a world of which we are a small part, and other people have the right to their human aspiration to do to live the lives that we have. And the second thing is, yes, let's talk about redistribution, but let's not pretend that that is the same thing as the broader narrative about, whether growth is good or not.
I'm not talking about Nigeria or Tanzania or Bangladesh. Those nations and people who live in poverty in those nations absolutely have a right to live well.
But that will damage the environment, as you will appreciate.
No, those people have a right to meet their human rights, to health and education and housing. That's the heart of donor economics. Leave nobody falling short on life's essentials. They have a right to the resources that we excessively use in this nation to be used for their development. I would keep quite separate the needs of development in Nigeria and Tanzania and Bangladesh from the massive excessive consumption of energy and resources in this country. I mean, to say that we should keep on growing to support them is like saying the rich man needs to keep eating more so some more crumbs fall off his table. They have the claim to the resources, and I believe we're going to see a lot more South-South trade and emergence of those nations. I'm talking about this country. We have to come back within planetary and meet them somewhere reasonable that's actually an accessible lifestyle for people worldwide, somewhere in the middle. So we need to come back down, and they need to rise up, and we meet somewhere in the middle. So
that's perfectly reasonable. But if I've heard you correctly, when you said, effectively you've got two, and we meet in the middle, is what you're saying, and this going to Helen's point about the impossibility of politics, is what you are saying that we should knowingly, actively, reduce the living standards of some people in a small number of Western rich countries and allow the living standards of poorer countries that we've talked about to continue to rise in whatever way as they choose to see fit. So actively reduce the living standards of people who we represent.
Well, you're saying living standards.
Yeah,
I
and I
think there's
use
a
that
gap
word very
between living
carefully.
standards and excessive resource use. So, for example, kids being driven to school in diesel fossil fuel cars, to me, is not living standards. Kids who can cycle to school with clean air in protected bike lanes, that's living standards. Massive reduction in energy and material use. So we want living standards that are nothing like as intensive as the ones we have, because we are over-consuming our fair share of Earth's resources, and in the process, creating climate change for people that hits people in Nigeria, waist deep in Bangladesh. They are looking at us saying, the world scientists can now prove you, your emissions are destabilizing the climate and causing these floods and these droughts. It's direct connection. So you're saying they say, don't stop us from growing. They're saying, could you please come back to a reasonable level of resource use so that we actually have a chance to thrive and our crops will grow and our harvests will mature. We need to come back within the means of the planet. I totally empathize that that's a very hard message to take to the public, because the adult generation today have been raised without an awareness of the planet, without an awareness of our wealth, without a recognition of the dependence of the whole world. I see a rising generation of young people. They are the ones who are seeing these connections, and they are the justice leaders, but we can't leave it up to them. We have to bring it into today's politics and take responsibility, because we are the generation in power. We can't say, oh, it's up to you, young people. I know no one's here saying that, but that's what I can't bear. It's up to you next. No, the generation that holds power now must find ways to transform politics, open up these debates, reduce our impact on the living world, rather than get caught in these, now there's no way we can do it. And I really want to, how do we transform this politics?
Thank you, Kate. Brilliant. Helen, just before we come to the audience for the millions of questions I know there will be, Helen, I just wanted to slightly shift the focus a little. I would call radical, I'm sure, Kate, you would just call sensible, a solution to a notion of your journey, what you would like us to be thinking about in the United Kingdom and all Western developed capitalist economies. I just wondered, Helen, in your mind, is there a starting point? I know you focused hugely on energy, but are there other economic things that could happen if we were to think about the inequities and the inequalities that we are facing as developed Western nations? I travel a lot on a plane to America, so apologies, but I spend a lot of time in America now. Our business is New York, London, and it is astonishing when you go there to see the iniquities of the world's richest country. You walk around New York, and there are people living in the subways, in sleeping bags, mental health issues, drug issues, whatever it might be. That is still a shocking sight, even though we see some of similar problems in the UK. I just wondered, Helen, beyond the solutions that Kate is outlining, in economic terms, can you sense there are any quicker, maybe easier fixes for the public to stomach in terms of inequality?
Well, one thing I think that is true, and this is or has become anyway bound up with the energy transition, I think that it's quite hard really for there to be a significant reduction in inequality, leaving aside what could be done still via redistribution, and I sort of agree, I think, with Bim's position, somewhat at least on that, without creating better paid jobs. And that really, I think, in Western countries means trying to have more manufacturing jobs again. And I think that that is what actually, in lots of ways, got us to the point which I think net zero was in significant part about, which was green growth, which was the idea that actually the energy transition itself would be the engine of growth, and that for Western countries, it would be an opportunity to recreate industrial manufacturing production, to reshore it from China, to get going again, in some sense to have a second industrial revolution, and to reset the economy in terms of these inequality issues, including inequality of regions, by doing that. I think the difficulty is that the energy transition economically is already really dominated by China. And now the United States is trying to play catch-up on quite a scale. That's what the US Inflation Reduction Act is. And I just don't think it's going to be possible, I'm afraid, for the United States to succeed at rebuilding its manufacturing industrial base and addressing inequality in the United States and providing some kind of political bulwark against a future Trump-style presidency, and for all the European countries who want to do it, including us, to be doing it at the same time. But the more that we can do that, the more that we can find better paying jobs that also have a certain dignity, I think, to them, that quite often the kind of service jobs that we've been creating since the 1970s, often casual, part-time. I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with part-time work, but they're not. I'm just not convinced that the distribution of employment in this country helps in this respect. But the more that we can do that, I think that the easier our politics will be, and I think it will do something, or it could do something to address the inequality.
The notion of being in work and poor
Yeah.
is a new and growing trend,
Yeah.
which is remarkable.
And it's very
we have
it's
high
very
employment,
problematic, yeah.
but still poverty.
And also because it generates such unbelievable stress for people and the mental health consequences. of that.
Fantastic. So, could we have the lights up? Welcome again for those watching online. We're live at the Southbank Centre in London. Can we have prosperity without growth? This intelligence squared debate. We have, quite literally, you could only come here if you were in the absolute top intelligence levels of the United Kingdom and growth. No, you don't put your hand down. You need to keep it up. So the cleverest questions we're going to get, but no speeches, please. I'm going to go over here. I did well. You did put your hand down, but you did put it up again. So I'm going to start over there. Do say hello. If you'd like to introduce yourself, do, but don't worry if you don't.
I'm
okay.
Gunnar Walford. I'm originally Swedish, but I live here now. I've done a lot of thinking around this, and I think one of the most, if you look at globalization, this is the ultimate bit of globalization. The environment situation we're in, we have to solve together. We can't sit in one country, do one thing, and another country do another thing. So I'd like to get your input onto how do we create a global cooperation around this to actually get somewhere?
Okay, now, Kate, we'll come to this person at the front. This will be brilliant. But Kate, could I start? So she's suggesting you can't have these two, that we can allow Tanzania to do one thing and Zaire to do another and Nigeria to do another, and we do something different. You've got to have global solutions, which seems to slightly maybe question your approach, which is the UK needs to do something different from other nations around the world. Or was that not what? I misheard you? Yeah.
I think a global approach
Yes.
means we collectively come back within the means of the planet's resources, and that is going to lead to a massive redistribution of who uses the remaining fossil fuel budget and who uses access to Earth's resources, so that we can have electricity and transport and communications and mobility in low-income countries today. But I want to connect back to what was just being talked about manufacturing. Nations need manufacturing, and let me come back to hosepipe, right? The history of manufacturing was this: linear and degenerative. Take Earth's materials, stick them in the pipe of production, make it in stuff we want, use it for a while, maybe throw it away, and spit the waste out the bottom. It's linear and degenerative by design. This is what destroys the life support systems of our planet. We need to turn the future of manufacturing into a circular, cyclical economy, so that resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully and collectively and creatively. Now, to do that, and Europe and the UK, well, first of all, the UK should absolutely still be in Europe. We're crazy to have left Europe, because right now is a time for cooperation. If we want a circular economy, to create a circular economy, it creates jobs, it brings jobs back home because we put labor and work, and it's creative and dignified around material reuse. But it needs scale. And Europe can do this now at a far more effective way than the UK, which has removed itself from that community just when we need to have that collaboration. So to me, circular economy is an example of working together. And since you're from Sweden, I do want to come back to a point. Bim was saying, nobody says, oh, I feel undertaxed. But hell, if we go to Sweden and we go to Finland, we say, man, I feel underprovided for. Because we are underprovided for in state provisioning. And it's a collective, right? Do you have low taxes and low public provisioning? Or do you have higher taxes and higher public provisioning? And people in the Netherlands and Sweden and Denmark and Finland, they look at the UK and they say, we really feel sorry for you. That's what all my friends from these countries are saying. What has happened to the UK? They love their public services and they are willing to pay for them because it's a collective contract. So we've come out in a low tax, low provisioning place where we have low expectations. So
we're not low tax, Kate, are we? We're at the highest tax burden we have had for many, many decades, are we not? It's a high tax situation we have in the UK at the moment, surely.
I don't think that's the case. You say people are feeling undertaxed, but relative to other European countries, we are not paying high taxes.
It's empirically true. Our tax burden as a percentage of GDP, notwithstanding the debate we had about GDP, is at a 70-year high. That's just true.
Anyway, let's answer the question.
Relative to other countries.
Kate's point, we should still be in the EU to do this, and there needs to be global cooperation to get results.
I mean, I think...
You can answer Kate
I don't
first.
want to... I mean, I think EU... I don't think we'll go into that.
Hold on. I'm the chair here. I'll say where we go.
Well, look,
should we be in the European Union? Although, Kate, if Germany had not lent so heavily into Russian gas supplies, we may not have had some of the messes we have had since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But let's to one side. Wim, should we be in the European Union to solve some of these issues that Kate is pointing out around sustainability?
We should definitely have European cooperation. Whether that's we've chosen to leave the European Union, but we can cooperate in all sorts of different ways, being outside the European Union, a bit like certain countries in Europe who are not in the European Union who cooperate. And indeed cooperation with countries like United States or Australia, of which we're not in any formal sort of political union, right? So I don't think cooperation necessitates being in the European Union. But the point that the lady over there made is a very, very good one, insofar as, and I think connects with a couple of things that have been said. I think that the global nature of the manufacturing problem, as far as we're sitting here, as far as we're concerned, is really critical. Because if you're in a situation in which the technological advances in, for example, things like artificial intelligence, we haven't touched on tonight, but I think they are happening at real pace, those connect with a green transition. And the people who I represent, and indeed all over the country, if they see that the job opportunities they can have and the income they can have is constrained despite all of these things happening, and we end up with a more hollowing out of the middle of the economy. So a few people at the top who are highly educated with certain skills, whether they be skills around management of capital or certain other skills. And then you have just a burgeoning group at the bottom where there is a need for high employment, but just not the sort of jobs that pay well enough, that have the high enough dignity, as Helen very rightly said. Then that's a recipe for social disaster. And so it is hugely incumbent upon us. And actually, just going back to Europe and the Brexit vote, I think that one of the things that we should remember as a consequence of that, rather as a cause of that Brexit vote at the time, were a lot of people in certain parts of this country who didn't feel that their economic aspirations were being met with the nature of the economy that we have. And I think it's incumbent upon us to really try and use the energy constraints and the difficulties that we talked about tonight to create those opportunities to, yes, have more of a circular economy, because of course it's wasteful. We all know that intuitively in our own households. My wife's going to laugh at this because she always thinks that I don't recycle properly. But, it is incumbent upon us, of course, to do that. And of course we can do more in that regard and produce higher quality jobs. And politically that helps us, because I think that a note of danger, China is an absolutely key player in everything we've talked about here this evening. And the growing enmity between China and the United States, I think, is one of the biggest things we're going to have to manage, not just in the next 10 or 15 years, but potentially the next 5. and what that does and the position that this country takes. So we've got to make sure we provide those jobs in this country and not, as much as we can, be dependent on whether it be in the European Union, the United States or China.
Bim, thank you. Person down here, yeah. There. Just wait for the microphone, it'd be wonderful. And then there's a gentleman in the middle. Can we get a mic to this person for the next question? Thank you.
Yeah, hello. I'm a professional campaigner and a member of Just Stop Oil. And thank you all so much for being on the panel, but especially thanks to Kate. Bim, I agreed with quite a lot of what you said. But my questions, plural, I have two questions. One is to Kate. You mentioned two politicians that I also hold in high esteem, Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis. I don't agree with his views on nuclear weapons. I'm a member of CND as well. But I wanted to know your opinion of the 2019 Labour manifesto and the proposals that would have brought the economy into a more of a sort of a, just like a more of a proper, what I call proper levelling up, you know, would have taxed the richest people, and the corporations like Google and Amazon, they would have had to pay their fair share of tax. I just wondering what your opinion was of Mr. Corbyn's 2019 manifesto. So that's a question for Kate. The question for the rest of the panel is, what are your thoughts on universal basic income, and what effect do you think UBI might have on an economy which is probably one of the most unequal economies in the world at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Helen, can I start with you? Because Kate, you've universal basic income. Again, this is one of those areas where I was thinking about inequity, which doesn't make the leap that obviously, Kate, you're speaking about that we need to make. But are there things like universal basic income which would start to solve some of the problems we're hearing reflected in this debate?
I must admit, I'm a sceptic about universal basic income. And one of the reasons is, what we've already touched on, is this issue of the relationship between work and dignity. And I think that the danger of the universal basic income is that it reinforces or creates new kinds of inequalities, and we'll have people who are permanently shut out of the prospects of employment, and that will replicate itself down the generations. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't, that I can't see what the arguments in its own terms are, and I think, you know, we do have to get to grips with what work is going to mean in what is going to be a really rather different, I think, economy as the energy transition proceeds. But I think that we have to try and hold on to the prospect that everybody can contribute via work to our society, and not entrench divisions between those who do and those who don't.
Great, thank you, Helen. Kate, on the question about Jeremy Corbyn and the John McDonnell's economic manifesto for the country, did you feel those were politicians or a political leader who was willing to have brave conversations about what the economy should be like?
Yes, I did. I think it can take... So I talk about an economic vision that isn't focused on growth. It's focused on a regenerative economy that works within the cycles of the living world, so massively reduces our material energies, and a distributive economy. And for me, the distributive economy isn't one where we say the economy is going to throw up great inequalities, let's only tax people. That's what we fall back on at the moment, and then we get caught in this challenge that we're discussing now of people, you know, their tax burden's very high, and nobody says, I want to be taxed more. I want to go deeper and say we need an economy that redistributes the sources of wealth creation. So I would like to have conversations in this country about who owns the land, who owns the housing. And housing is actually a really great asset to think about. Housing has this extraordinary double role. It's become, in this country and many others, a fantastic investment for those who have huge amounts of wealth to make another return on their assets, on their money. It's also a human right. So in some cities, you get young people, not even so young people, who can never get on the housing ladder because they are competing with mega landlords who are reaping in the rents. Vienna, 60% of people live in social housing that's high quality, central, affordable, and normal, because the city of Vienna decided 100 years ago that housing is a human right. And so it was going to be held and owned by the city, and make it accessible to everybody. And that seems really radical. But I think there are really deep conversations about who owns the housing, who owns the land, who owns the utilities, who owns the enterprises. City of Atlanta in the US has 5 times more black entrepreneurs owning businesses because that city decided, unlike many other US cities around, to focus on that, to make sure that people of color who'd typically been marginalized from business ownership could own, and they invested in supporting those entrepreneurs. They now own the companies rather than being a wage worker who's hoping to get some redistribution because they've got in-work poverty. So I want to go deeper and look at redistributing the sources of wealth creation. And I just want to come back to the universal basic income point. In Stockton, California, there was an excellent trial about this. And I think UBI is a really challenging, could it work in practice? There are small places that are experimenting, and the world needs them because they are showing us what's possible. In Stockton, they said households who were on less than 40% of the median income, so really low-income houses, will get, I think, $1,000 a month. And they just said, you have this for 18 months, you can use it however you need. We just want to know how you used it. Turned out those people used that money to pay the bus fare to go and try out for another job. They used it to get out of the trap of poverty. That means you can't, right? If you're so poor that if you take a risk and it goes wrong, your family falls over the edge, you can't take any risks. So it actually enabled people to get out of long-term poverty. So it's not universal because it's being targeted at the lowest households. But it, to me, shows what reveals is that people are trapped in poverty, and having that income, that unconditional income, can enable them to make choices and free themselves from that. But I would love to see us invest in universal basic services, right? Great public health, great public education, so that we don't have to spend money on private versions of it, but it's a public service. Again, I'm going to go back to Scandinavia, where they pay more tax and they get more delivery.
Great, thank you, Kate. I'm assuming, Bim, you did support Jeremy Corbyn's economic manifesto, so I won't come to you. I won't come to you for that question. Gentleman here.
Hi, thanks
and
for...
then there's someone at the back then for the next question. Thank you. Yeah, go on, sir.
Thanks for the excellent debate. I'm Hassan Damaluji. I'm the co-founder of Global Nation. It's an internationalist think tank. I almost didn't ask this question because there was an earlier one, but it wasn't well answered, or it wasn't really dug into, especially by you, Kate. And so I'd really like to press you on the following. The elephant in the room here, when you want a country to stop growing or even to shrink its economy, is that is an entirely irrational choice in an adversarial world. The fundamental enabling environment for countries to be able rationally to take that decision is one where they are not under threat. You know, China had relatively low growth but high relative prosperity for hundreds of years. Europe had much higher growth. Then European armies came along and the century of humiliation, as it's called in China, resulted, right? That could easily happen to this country. So the fundamental building block politically is a world that is not adversarial. And so what is your vision of that world, acknowledging that until you and others and we all have made that happen, it wouldn't even make sense for countries to take your advice? Thanks.
Great question, and I really agree that is one of the major problems. So I think about the ways in which we're structurally dependent upon endless growth, right? We can't easily give up growth. That's why we need to get onto the case now, because we are structurally dependent on it financially. We've got a financial system that's structured, expecting returns. We've got a social system expecting higher living standards means having more stuff, more cars, flying further on a holiday. So we've got social addiction to growth, and we've got a political addiction to growth. And at the heart of it is that no major politician wants to lose their place in the G20 family photo, right? No prime minister wants to get kicked out of the G20 family photo. But if your nation stops growing while the rest keeps going, you will. You'll be booted out by the next emerging powers. Totally agree. And this isn't an economic question, actually. I think this is an international geopolitic question. How do we have a different kind of politics that doesn't mean that your power in the room, in the world, at the table, is because you have a large GDP, which means you can have a large military arsenal. Again, smaller countries banding together, the European project is one way around that. The one exception that we've seen in recent years is the rise of a group of countries, small countries, Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Finland, saying we're going to go off and be the well-being economy governments. We're going to set a different, rather than trying to be the biggest and most powerful, we're going to go and pursue well-being and thriving. But the major countries aren't doing that. And I completely agree with you. I don't have the answer to that. But it doesn't mean that the Stopping Growth project therefore fails and we carry on. You just mentioned the elephant in the room, a Swahili saying, when the elephants fight, or indeed when the elephants make love, it's the grass that gets trampled. When Russia and China and the US are embattled and pursuing resources, this is going to take us to planetary destruction. So that's not a nice future either, and I know you completely know this. We need collectively, as humans on this planet, to figure out how to stop embattling ourselves one against another without the appearance of an alien threat, right? It almost seems it's only an outside enemy that makes us suddenly band together, whether it's as a nation or a region. That enemy isn't coming. We have to figure this out. And to me, this is exactly the hardest challenge. How are we going to stop our addiction to growth? Because I'm going to bigger and bigger to be bigger than you're biggering and biggering. And we destroy the living world. And life looks on and says, humanity, you really screwed that one up. I don't know. And if anyone knows, that this is the answer.
I'm going to go. Yeah, thank you, Kate. There's a person at the back on the left there with, wave a little. That was lovely. Thank you so much. And then there's someone just in front with two hands. Just so you put two hands up there. So you doubled your chances of catching my eye. Well done. That's a good economic lesson right there. You grew your hands. But the person at the back, thank you.
Very simple question. Would really like to hear from each of the panelists what you all think we should be doing about housing in the UK, but specifically London. I'm 29 years old. I've lived in London all my life. I'm terrified about what's happening with housing prices, both on a rental and home owning perspective. I think each of you have probably got very interesting views from different perspectives and would love to hear them.
Great, thank you so much. Bim, kick us off on housing.
I'm alarmed about it too. Two things I do in the short term. One is we need to build huge amounts on government-owned land of social housing. If we did that, and I'm a conservative and I believe in home ownership, not just in a human sense, but actually going back to growth as essential for younger people to earn their first stake in society and life, to build and grow their families and the life they want to build for the future, right? So I think that if we can build a lot more social housing, and the government owns, I don't know how many millions of acres in this country, we can do that on our own land. By doing that, with a Help to Buy element, if it's a Conservative, maybe Labour politicians may choose not to have that, but if you did that, it would hugely increase just the supply. I would ring-fence that for younger people, say under 40. I would ring-fence that. So that's the first thing I would do. And I think that's something we can actually do. Because one of the things that we haven't talked about tonight, but something I'm very seasoned on, I'm doing some work at it at the moment that will come out in a couple of weeks, is millennials, sort of under 45s, and their real dissatisfaction with the economic system that they find themselves in. And as a Conservative Party, it's not a given that these people, a lot of my colleagues think, oh, well, it's fine. As people get older, they just become Conservative. It isn't actually happening. This generation, for the first time, that people have actually looked back. And I think a core reason for that is people not being able to achieve their aspirations. And what are we in politics for unless we're helping people achieve their aspirations? So on home ownership, that is one concrete thing I would do.
Great, Bim. Helen.
I agree on, I wouldn't just build social housing. I would think the planning laws have got to be reformed too for building homes for people to own. I also think that we have to look at the way in which our tax system, I think, still incentivises the use of London in particular for foreigners to basically buy housing for investment purposes, to hold as an asset. And I think this has done terrible damage to London as a place to live over the last, really since it took off post the 2008 crash. Partly it is a function of the monetary environment that was created by the crash, but I think our tax system has also incentivized it in ways that are unacceptable, because if we don't do something for your generation where housing concerned, I think that the social and political consequences will be destabilizing for generations to come, not just for your generation.
Thank you so much, Helen. Kate, we have to keep it brief. We're coming up to the last 3 minutes of this amazing debate. I have promised 2 hands there that he's going to get a question. And also, there is one person on this panel who has also some ropes with her, and we need to get those on stage as well. So we're going to be busy. So, Kate, very quickly on housing.
The problem is that if we build tens of thousands of new houses, we blow our carbon budget. We are now living within a constrained budget. We have to come with new solutions. The best building is one that already exists. We need to retrofit, and we need to reclaim buildings and houses that have been turned into investment assets for UK and international investors. That is housing. It should be a human right. Those buildings should be used to house Londoners as a human right.
Fabulous. The gentleman just a few rows down. So.
Hi everyone. A question from a two-handed guy. Bim, for you, so the point was raised today multiple times that we're overspending. Would you tomorrow bring the bill to the Parliament proposing 2,000 private jets in UK to be sold and this money spent on NHS? If no, why?
Excellent. Bim, so
Who owns them at the moment?
2,000 private jets in the UK owned by, I presume, 5% rich population or corporations. As an example, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So would you ban private ownership or corporate ownership of private jets today, tomorrow, bring a bill to Parliament? And if not, why not?
I wouldn't. And the reason why I wouldn't is that another cool thing about this country, and one of the reasons why people come here and love living here, is a rule of law. It is property ownership being a core function of how we all live our lives. And in extremis, you might do that if it's criminals or somebody, if there's a rogue state, and Russia have had their own issues with various things that they've owned in this country and elsewhere. But even if you were to do that, notwithstanding my concerns, the amount of money that you would raise from that might seem significant, but it would be a drop in the ocean in the context of all the challenges we're talking about. So I'm not even sure that you would even get the real positive benefit at the end as well.
Helen?
I have a huge problem with private jets.
What, getting them?
Yeah.
You can't find them anywhere.
And that I think that when you understand as well, like how generously they are often treated in terms of calculating carbon emissions and carbon rules, it's a pretty difficult state of affairs to swallow. But the idea, I think, that we could just legislate and ban them tomorrow is not going to happen. And I think that we do have to think, though, quite seriously about carbon taxes and if that isn't a better way of dealing with the private jet problem than simply banning them.
Yeah. Kate?
Cities around the world are banning diesel cars. Why would you carry on allowing something far, far more polluting?
Kate, get your ropes out.
Well, the thing about the ropes...
I can help. I'm here to help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Helen touched on...
I'll pass the rope.
This is the thrilling, for those the millions who are watching around the world, this is the thrilling last moments of this debate.
Okay, so Helen mentioned earlier green growth.
Yes.
And many politicians and economists say, we're okay, we've got green growth happening in this country. And this is the problem of the green growth dream, right? Let's say that this is GDP, okay? And let's say you're...
Do I have to do anything?
You don't have to do anything, you hold it right there. You're 2000 and I'm 2020, okay? So this is what's happened to GDP over time. There was a bump, we know there was a bump, but there was a financial crisis in there, but it goes up. Now, what's happening in the UK and some high-income countries is carbon emissions like this are going down. Everyone says, yes, green growth, it's done, the dream. Here's the point. Carbon emissions need to be falling this fast. So they are not falling anything like fast enough. And while we carry on wanting growth and green, and we want both, you can bet that when push comes to shove, we know what's going to win. We're going to go for growth, and we will fail to cut our carbon emissions. So the dream of green growth is a story that has not been achieved. We have nothing like fast enough cuts in carbon emissions. And when we're not talking about carbon emissions, we're talking about material use. What's happened to the UK's material use? It's right up here. It's not decoupling at all. Same as the US, same across Europe. We have failed to decouple our material use. That's why we need a circular economy. That's why it needs to be regulation. It should be in order. and it will unleash creativity and it will create jobs. Boundaries unleash creativity. This is what we need now.
Excellent description with low carbon impact. Thank you so much for being such a brilliant audience. Thank you for all tuning in from all around the world to this fantastic debate from Intelligence Squared at the Southbank Centre in London. Can we have prosperity without growth? You've been brilliant, but even more brilliant has been our panel, Kate, Helen and Bim. Thank you very much. Safe home, everyone.